My name is Madison, and I am 29 years old. I had spent years imagining the moment I would finally breathe, without pressure crushing my ribs, the day I would choose myself, without apology, and that moment arrived quietly, the morning I quit my job. There was no dramatic speech, no slammed door, just a calm email and a trembling finger hovering over the send button. I moved to a secluded lakehouse in the Pacific Northwest, a place of cedar wood and mist. But my peace was shattered by a single vibration. My mother was calling, "Welcome to When Karma Strikes channel. I'm sitting in my garden today, watching the fish swim peacefully. It reminds me that life isn't always as calm as the surface suggests, much like the quiet lake house Madison found. Where are you watching from? Do you have a favorite peaceful spot or a garden of your own? I love reading about your world. Now, let's return to Madison, as her peace is suddenly shattered. Everything in my new home smelled like cedar and damp earth. It was a sensory sanctuary, far away from the fluorescent lights and the constant, buzzing anxiety of the litigation firm. For 3 days, I had lived in a world where the only schedule was the rising mist over the water. Then, the phone rang. Brenda's name on the screen didn't just feel like a call. It felt like a breach of security. I stared at it until the final ring, my stomach tightening into a familiar, jagged knot. When I finally answered, there was no hello. There was no inquiry about my health, or how I was settling into the $520,000 home I had just purchased, with every cent of my independent labor. Instead, her voice arrived like a summons. "We are moving in tomorrow," she said. The tone was flat, final, and carried the weight of someone who assumed my life was merely an annex of her own. "Your dad said it is fine," she added, as if Gary's passive silence was a legal seal of approval. I sat on my wooden deck, the cold air hitting my face, but I felt nothing but a sudden, sharp clarity. For a second, my mind tried to find a way to accommodate them. That was the old Madison, the one who viewed her parents as a debt that could never be fully repaid. But the litigation analyst in me took over. I realized Brenda wasn't asking for a room. She was staging a hostile takeover. She even added, with a cold, sharper edge, "If you do not like it, you can find somewhere else." The audacity of that sentence hit me like a physical blow. She was telling me to find somewhere else to live, in the house I owned. My hands shook, but I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't beg for her to understand my need for space. Instead, a strange, electric focus settled over me. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I realized she had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to stop being a daughter and start being a landlord. I hung up the phone without another word. The silence of the lake returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a courtroom before the judge enters. I walked to my office, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. I didn't open a suitcase to pack. I opened my laptop. I pulled up a file I had been quietly maintaining for years, a folder I called the Family Ledger. This wasn't a breakdown. This was accounting. By the time the moon was high over the pines, the trembling in my fingers had stopped. I wasn't a victim of an invasion. I was preparing a surprise for their arrival. I pulled up the spreadsheet I had kept hidden in a password-protected drive for 3 years. Most people keep photos of their parents in their digital archives. I kept receipts. As the blue light of the laptop screen reflected in my eyes, I realized that I hadn't been a daughter to Brenda and Gary for a long time. I had been a silent investor in their version of a lifestyle they couldn't afford. My compassion had been a luxury they'd been overdrafting for over a decade. And tonight, the account was finally hitting zero. I began to scroll. It started small. $3,000 for a car repair that never seemed to happen. $800 for a utility bill that was supposedly a week away from shutoff. But then, the numbers began to swell, blooming like bruises on a page. Over 12 years, the total was staggering. $115,000. That was the price of my good daughter status. It was a subscription fee I had paid monthly to keep the peace, to keep the ribs from crushing. and to keep the illusion of a family alive. One specific entry made my breath hitch: the $24,000 I sent when I was 24. I remember that year vividly. I was working 80-hour weeks at the firm, living on cold coffee and adrenaline, barely sleeping. Brenda had called me hysterical, claiming Gary needed emergency gallbladder surgery, and their insurance had a massive deductible they couldn't meet. Gary had been in the background, silent as always, his presence acting as the silent reinforcement for her lies. I didn't hesitate. I drained my modest savings and took out a personal loan to cover the rest. I thought I was saving my father's life. 3 months later, I flew home for a surprise visit. There was no surgical scar on Gary. In fact, he seemed confused when I asked how he was recovering, but I saw it. Tucked away in the back of Brenda's closet was a limited edition designer handbag that cost exactly $6,000, and a series of high-end spa receipts that accounted for the rest. They hadn't used the money for a hospital bed. They had used it for a luxury vacation, while I was working myself into an early grave to pay back the loan. When I confronted Brenda, she didn't apologize. She just looked at me and said, "You have so much, Madison. Why shouldn't your mother have something nice too?" That was the moment I realized my love was being treated like a commodity. I was a resource to be harvested, not a human to be held. Sitting there in my Lakehouse, looking at the total $115,000, I felt a wave of the sunk cost fallacy try to pull me under. A voice in my head whispered that since I had already given so much, I might as well give this too. I might as well let them have the guest room. But then I looked at the lake. The mist was thick and gray, hiding the water, but I knew the depths were cold and unforgiving. This wasn't about revenge. It was about an audit. I had been the family's bank for 12 years, and the bank was officially closed for business. I began to draft a formal itemization of every dollar I had ever sent them. Every emergency, every loan, every gift that was coerced through guilt. I didn't summon regret, because there was no room for it. There was only the balance sheet. I was done being a daughter on a subscription plan. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the Lakehouse was broken, not by the call of a loon, but by the sharp, persistent vibration of my phone on the nightstand. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. Brenda didn't understand time zones or boundaries. She only understood her own needs. I picked up the device and saw a photo. It was a grainy shot of a bright yellow moving truck, parked in a driveway I recognized all too well. The caption read, "All loaded up. We should be there by noon. Make sure there is space in the driveway for the ramp." I stared at the image of the massive yellow truck, wondering which credit card they had maxed out to pay for it, or if they'd used the very last of the stolen HELOC money to fund this final invasion. They were spending their remaining crumbs on a gamble, betting that I would be too weak to turn them away once they were parked on my gravel. I didn't jump out of bed. I didn't feel the frantic need to call her and scream that she couldn't come. I simply sat up, the cold mountain air raising goosebumps on my arms, and watched the messages start to pour in, like a sequence of scripted attacks. Brenda was shifting into her primary mode of combat, the sacrificial mother card. "I cannot believe you are being so difficult about this," the next text read. "After everything your father and I have done for you, I carried you for 9 months. I spent 20 years making sure you had every advantage. We sacrificed our youth so you could have that fancy degree and that big city job. And now, when we are in a bind, you want to treat us like strangers? It is heartbreaking, Madison, truly heartbreaking." I stared at the words 9 months. In my previous life, those words would have been a leash, pulling me back into a state of guilty compliance. But looking at it through the lens of a litigation analyst, I saw a faulty contract. A 9-month biological lease does not grant a lifetime of squatter's rights over an adult daughter's sanity or her property. My mother didn't view me as a person. She viewed me as a high-yield savings account that she had decided to liquidate without notice. Then came the reinforcement. Gary finally broke his silence, though it was clearly dictated by Brenda. "Madison, be a big person here," his text read. "Your mother is under a lot of stress. We already gave notice on our place, and the new tenants are moving in tomorrow. We literally have nowhere else to go. Do not break your mother's heart over a guest room. We are family. Family helps each other. The manipulation was perfect. It was a pincer movement of guilt and urgency, designed to make me feel like a monster if I didn't surrender my keys. They had intentionally burned their own bridges to make sure I was forced to build them a new one. It was a calculated move to trap me in a corner where my only choices were compliant daughter or family villain. I stood by the window and watched the mist roll off the lake. I felt a strange, detached curiosity. I wondered if they realized that in all those texts, in all that emotional grandstanding, not once had they asked if I was okay. Not once had they asked why I had quit my job or if I was happy. They weren't coming to see me. They were coming to occupy a resource. The realization didn't hurt. It simplified everything. I didn't reply to a single message. I didn't give them the fuel of an argument. Arguments are for people who still think there is a middle ground to be found. I went into the kitchen, brewed a pot of black coffee, and sat back down at my laptop. If they wanted to play a game of high-stakes occupancy, fine. But they were walking into a courtroom, not a family reunion. I didn't answer the phone when it rang again 10 minutes later. I didn't even look at the screen to see Brenda's face. In my old life, I would have been pacing the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs, rehearsing a dozen different ways to say no without sounding ungrateful. But that Madison was gone. She had been replaced by a version of me that viewed this entire situation as a failing corporate merger. My parents were the subsidiary attempting a hostile takeover of the parent company, and I was the litigation analyst hired to shut it down. I decided to implement the gray rock method. It is a psychological technique I had studied during my darkest months at the firm. The goal is to make yourself as uninteresting, as unresponsive, and as cold as a plain gray pebble on the ground. It was a way to starve Brenda of the drama she craved. By becoming a gray rock, I was choosing to be a non-event, someone who offers no emotional fuel, no matter how hard they poke or prod. For a narcissist, silence is the ultimate courtroom, and I was about to give her a life sentence of it. You don't argue, you don't explain, you don't defend. Narcissists like Brenda feed on emotional reactions, whether they are positive or negative. By becoming a gray rock, I was cutting off her oxygen supply. I wasn't going to give her the high of a shouting match or the satisfaction of my tears. I was becoming a non-event. I opened a fresh document on my laptop. I wasn't writing a letter to my mother. I was drafting a formal short-term rental agreement. I used the same clinical, detached language I had used for years in high-stakes litigation. I listed the terms with lethal precision. Monthly rent, $3,500, the exact market rate for a luxury lakefront property in this county. Security deposit, $7,000, due in full upon entry. I added clauses about quiet hours starting at 9 in the evening, a strictly enforced no-smoking policy, and a provision that any permanent alterations to the property would result in immediate eviction. Then, I attached the family ledger spreadsheet as an addendum. I titled it, Statement of Outstanding Family Contributions, 2014 to 2026. I wanted them to see the number $115,000 in black and white. It wasn't an emotional plea for them to recognize my sacrifice. It was an accounting of the debt they had already accrued. It was proof that the subscription of my loyalty had been paid in full, and the bill was now past due. I didn't send a text back. I didn't return Gary's call. Instead, I sent a formal email to their shared account. The subject line was, Terms and Conditions for Potential Occupancy. I kept the body of the email to a single, cold sentence. Attached are the legal and financial requirements for your stay at this private residence. Please review and have all documents notarized before arrival. I hit send. I felt a strange sense of power. For the first time in 29 years, the ground under my feet was mine. I wasn't reacting to their chaos. I was defining the parameters of their existence in my world. My laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I took a sip of my black coffee and looked out at the water. The mist was starting to burn off, revealing the cold, deep blue beneath. I was ready. I wasn't just checking the ledger anymore. I was digging into the foundation of my own credit. The purchase of the Lakehouse had required a deep dive into my financial history, and while the bank had cleared me, something in the fine print had been nagging at the back of my litigation-trained brain. I opened my full credit report, the long, clinical list of every debt and every inquiry attached to my name for the last decade. And there it was, a line item tucked away in a submenu of closed accounts, a home equity line of credit, also known as a HELOC. The amount was $40,000. It was linked to my parents' previous home, the one they had just moved out of. My heart didn't race. It went cold, like the water at the bottom of the lake. I looked at the date the account was opened, June 12th, 2024. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen until the numbers blurred. I remembered June of 2024 perfectly. I spent that entire month in London. I was working on a cross-border merger that required me to be in a secure office in Canary Wharf from 8 in the morning until midnight, every single day. I hadn't been in the country, let alone at a notary's office in my hometown. I pulled up my old travel records and bank statements from that month. There were no flights home. There were only charges for London Underground fares and overpriced coffee in the British capital. I looked back at the digital copy of the HELOC application. There it was, my signature, or rather, a version of it. It was a practiced, shaky imitation of my handwriting, scrawled on a document that listed me as a co-guarantor for $40,000. They hadn't just overdrafted my kindness. They had committed identity theft. My mother had kept a digital folder of my sensitive documents, my social security card, and previous tax filings from the years I spent managing their finances. They bypassed the bank's physical verification by using an online application portal and a local notary who was a longtime family friend, someone who didn't ask questions when my mother claimed I was away on business but had already signed the papers in advance. They turned my childhood loyalty into a digital weapon. They had forged my name to borrow money they knew they could never pay back, using my perfect credit score as their personal collateral. This wasn't a family emergency or a misunderstanding. This was a felony. My mother's voice from the phone call echoed in my head. "We're moving in tomorrow. Your dad said it's fine." Suddenly, their rush to move into my home made sense. They weren't just looking for a guest room. They were running from the wreckage of the financial house of cards they had built, using my name as the foundation. They had sold their house to cover other debts, but this $40,000 was still out there, hanging over my head like a guillotine. I rubbed my eyes, but I didn't feel tired anymore. I felt like I was back in the courtroom, looking at a defendant who had just been caught in a blatant lie. This was the kill shot. In litigation, there is always one piece of evidence that makes the entire defense collapse. This was it. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I simply downloaded the document and saved it into a folder labeled Evidence. The arrival. The betrayal wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow rot I had finally decided to expose to the light. I realized then that there was no path back to being a good daughter. That Madison was dead, buried under $40,000 of forged debt. As I watched the first real sunlight hit the surface of the lake, I realized that I wasn't just protecting my home anymore. I was preparing to prosecute my past. The sound of tires on gravel announced their arrival exactly at noon. I watched from the living room window as the black SUV rolled into my driveway, with the massive yellow moving truck I'd seen in the photo lumbering close behind it. It looked like a predatory shadow following its scout, both vehicles stopping with the unearned confidence of an invading army. Brenda stepped out first, her eyes immediately scanning the cedar siding and the expansive deck with a look of predatory satisfaction. She wasn't looking at my home as a place of healing. She was surveying her new kingdom. Gary followed, his shoulders hunched, carrying that same absent expression he had worn my entire life, the face of a man who watched his wife set fires and simply handed her the matches. They didn't knock. Brenda pushed the front door open and marched into the entryway, as if she were crossing a finish line. She didn't look at me. She looked at the dust on the baseboards. "Madison, you really should have swept before we got here," she called out, her voice echoing through the high ceilings. Criticism arrived before affection, as it always did. Gary stood behind her, a silent shadow in the doorway. I stood firmly in the center of the entryway, physically blocking the path to the rest of the house. I had seen enough legal cases to know that once they moved their boxes past this threshold and slept a single night, they could claim residency. I wasn't going to let a single suitcase touch my floor until the terms were signed and the trap was set. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer a hug or a glass of water. I simply stood by the dining room table, where 3 thick, white folders were resting in a neat row. "I prepared something for you," I said. My voice was level, almost detached. Brenda paused, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. "Oh, please, Madison, don't start with the drama," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "We have been driving for hours. We just want to get settled into our room." "Which one is ours? The one with the lake view?" I didn't answer. I gestured toward the table. I opened the first folder and slid it toward her. "This is the itemized audit of the last 12 years, I told her. $115,000. Every rent payment I covered, every medical bill I paid, every luxury you demanded under the guise of an emergency." Brenda's face tightened. "Are you seriously trying to bill your parents?" she demanded, her voice rising into that familiar register of outraged entitlement. Gary shifted uncomfortably, looking at the floor. I didn't let her finish. I opened the second folder. "This is a copy of the HELOC application from June of 2024, I said. $40,000. It features a signature that looks remarkably like mine, despite the fact that I was 3,000 miles away in London on the day it was notarized. The color drained from Brenda's face so fast, it was almost cinematic. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. I looked her directly in the eye. "That is a felony, mother. It is identity theft and bank fraud. I have the travel records and the forensic evidence to prove I wasn't there. And don't think your family friend at the notary office is safe either. I've already drafted a formal complaint to the Secretary of State to have their commission revoked, along with a civil suit for professional negligence. I am dismantling the entire network you used to betray me, starting with anyone who dared to put a legal seal on your lies." I opened the third folder. "This is a short-term rental agreement. If you stay as tenants. You will pay $3,500 a month. You will sign this agreement, which includes a clause that you will repay the $40,000 you stole within 24 months. Or I will hand this second folder to the district attorney." The explosion I expected finally came. Brenda screamed that I was ungrateful, that I was a monster, and that family doesn't do this to each other. But for the first time in my life, her words had nowhere to land. I was a gray rock. I was a courtroom. I was the law in my own home. Gary finally spoke, his voice strained. "Madison, this is extreme." "No," I replied quietly. "What was extreme was assuming you could take my life whenever it suited you. You believed authority traveled with you. It doesn't. It stayed at the gate. You can sign the agreement and pay your way, or you can get back in that SUV and find somewhere else. The choice is entirely yours. And for once, you have no power over the outcome." Brenda looked around the room, and for the first time, she saw it for what it was, a fortress she couldn't breach. She looked smaller, suddenly older. They didn't sign. They couldn't afford to. Without a word, Brenda turned and walked out the door, her heels clicking sharply on the wood. Gary followed her, a silent reinforcement until the very end. I stood on the deck and watched them drive away, the ocean of green pines swallowing the SUV. The fear that had defined my life dissolved into a cold, beautiful certainty. I was finally alone, and for the first time, I was safe. The sound of their engine faded into the distance, until there was nothing left but the wind in the pines. I stayed on the deck for a long time, watching the sun dip toward the mountains. The lake was a deep, unbothered blue, echoing the stillness that had finally returned to my home. In the movies, this moment would have been loud, a triumphant musical score, or a dramatic collapse into tears. But my victory was silent. It was the sound of a heavy door finally locking into place. It was the feeling of a debt being settled, not with money, but with truth. I went back inside and looked at the 3 white folders sitting on the table. They looked like ordinary office supplies, but they were the blueprints of my liberation. I picked them up and put them in a drawer. I didn't need to look at the numbers anymore. $115,000 of documented support, $40,000 of forged debt. Those figures no longer defined my worth. They defined the distance I had traveled to save myself. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink and realized that for the first time in 29 years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing for a phone call. I was just living. Over the next few weeks, the silence of the Lakehouse became my best friend. I didn't hear from Brenda or Gary again. There were no more texts about family duty or broken hearts. When you show a predator the cage you've built for them, they rarely come back to test the bars. I spent my mornings watching the mist, and my afternoons walking the shoreline. I had escaped the crushing pressure in my ribs, and in its place, I found a steady, quiet strength. Looking back on that night, I have come to realize something that I think many of us struggle to admit. We are often taught that family is an unconditional contract, a bond that justifies any amount of self-sacrifice. But I have learned that love without respect is just control, wearing a kinder mask. If you find yourself in a situation where your peace is treated like a commodity, remember that you are allowed to perform an audit on your own life. You are allowed to count the cost of your loyalty. We often stay in toxic situations because of the sunk cost, the idea that because we've already given so much, we have to keep giving until there is nothing left. But the truth is, the only way to stop losing is to stop paying. Forgiveness is a beautiful thing, but it isn't a requirement for your healing. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to be cold and clinical. Sometimes, the only way to find your voice is to let the silence do the talking. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's just the act of setting yourself free from the expectation that they will ever change. I didn't get an apology, and I didn't get my $40,000 back. But I got my future. I learned that no is a complete sentence, and that boundaries aren't meant to punish others. They are meant to protect the version of you that finally learned how to breathe. If you are standing at your own send button today, trembling and afraid, just know that the peace on the other side is worth every bit of the struggle. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to draw a hard line with family to save your own sanity, let me know in the comments. Your peace is worth the price of their discomfort. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they are allowed to choose themselves. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of reclamation and justice.